If you've ever stood in a room where the laughter wasn't meant for you, where every smile curled up at the edges with something sour behind it, you'll understand exactly how I felt that afternoon. My name is Marjorie. And at 68 years old, I thought I had outgrown caring what my family thought of me. But that was before they made me feel like a burden in my own home. It was a Saturday in early spring. The air still a little cold, and the house smelled like lemon oil and old wood. My niece, Kelsey, was bustling around the dining table, placing napkins just so, while my sister-in-law, Janet, hovered behind her, making loud, false compliments about how organized I was for an old lady. I'd heard worse over the years, but there was something about the way she said old lady that scraped across my heart like a dull blade. I had invited them, my brother, his wife, their grown children, because it felt polite. Because even though I knew they saw me as a frail widow clinging to a house too big for one person, I still believed that family meant something. I still believed in decency. But that day, when they thought I was in the kitchen stirring soup, I heard them. "She's got no backbone," Janet said, her voice low but not low enough. Honestly, she'd sign over this place if we asked. She just wants us to love her. A snort of agreement came from my nephew, Todd. "It's pathetic. She can't even stand up for herself. She's lucky we bother visiting." And then Kelsey's soft voice, maybe the only one I ever thought had a shred of kindness, joined in. "Well, Uncle Dave said she put all our names on the deed after Harold died. Maybe she figures if she gives us the house now, she won't die alone." My hands trembled so violently I had to set the wooden spoon down. The clatter echoed in the kitchen, but no one came to see if I was all right. For a moment, I tried to tell myself I'd misheard them, that my family wouldn't talk about me like that. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the first time. It was only the first time they'd been careless enough to let me hear. I pressed my palm against the countertop to steady myself. My late husband, Harold, had loved this house. He'd built the front porch, himself, plank by plank, while I carried him iced tea in the evenings. When he passed, the grief hollowed me out, made me cling to the only thing that still felt like home. This house, our house. And yes, after the funeral, when everyone was so helpful and attentive, I thought maybe sharing ownership would keep us close. I thought giving them each a piece of this place would make them feel connected to me, obligated to care. But in that moment, listening to them scheme, all I could feel was the humiliating weight of my own desperation. "She's never going to change," Janet was saying. "She's always been weak." Weak. The word echoed in my mind as I wiped my eyes with the back of my sleeve. For years, I'd swallowed their judgments. I'd told myself it didn't matter, that as long as they were family, I could tolerate the condescension. But standing there, I realized something I should have known decades ago. Love that demands your submission isn't love at all. I took a deep breath and stepped into the doorway. They didn't notice me right away. Kelsey was unwrapping silverware. Todd was scrolling through his phone, and Janet was pointing out a scuff on the wall. She said, "Just ruined the place." My heart pounded in my ears, and for a moment, I thought I might just turn around and pretend I hadn't heard anything. But then Janet looked up, and her smile died. She knew I'd heard every word. For once, I didn't look away. I held her gaze, feeling something unfamiliar swelling in my chest, a heat that wasn't shame, wasn't sorrow. It was something stronger. Resolve. "I'll be right back," I said, my voice calm in a way that surprised even me. "Make yourselves comfortable." I turned and walked down the hall to the study. My knees were weak, but I didn't falter. I unlocked the old roll-top desk Harold had loved, pulled out the thick blue folder I hadn't touched in years. My fingers brushed across the paperwork, the deed I'd so trustingly amended. The signatures were all there, mine and theirs, a record of my own misguided hope. I stared down at the document, the names that no longer deserved to be tied to this house, and something inside me shifted. I knew in that instant that this was the day everything would change. that no matter how they protested or tried to guilt me, I was taking my name and my life back. They thought I had no backbone. They were about to see exactly how wrong they were. I don't remember sitting back down with them. I don't remember eating the soup or listening to Janet pretend nothing had happened. My mind was already elsewhere, sifting through the memories of the day I'd signed those papers. My brother David had smiled and told me it was just a precaution, that it would make things easier when the time came. How easy it had been to convince me. How ready I was to cling to any scrap of belonging after Harold was gone. That night, after they'd all filed out with their to-go containers and shallow goodbyes, I sat at the kitchen table in the quiet. I didn't cry. That surprised me most of all. There was nothing left to mourn. I had grieved my husband. I had grieved the life we'd built. But now I was done grieving the approval of people who only valued me for what I could give them. I slept badly, waking before dawn to the ache in my knees and a tension in my chest that wouldn't ease until I did what needed to be done. So I brewed my coffee extra strong and watched the sunrise spread across the yard Harold had loved so much. At 8 sharp, I called my attorney. Her name was Margaret Dawson, a woman about my age, with the kind of no-nonsense voice that made you sit up straight even over the phone. "Marjorie," she said when I told her who it was. "What can I do for you?" I hesitated, feeling a tightness in my throat. "I need to remove some names from the deed." A beat of silence. "All right," Margaret said carefully. "Why don't you come in this morning? Bring whatever paperwork you have." I could hear the questions she didn't ask. Why now, after all this time? But she didn't press. That was why I'd trusted her when Harold died. I hung up, went to the study, and pulled the folder into my tote bag. My hand brushed over the family photos along the hallway. Kelsey as a toddler in Harold's lap. Todd holding sparklers in the yard. David grinning by the barbecue. For a moment, I felt that old pang again. The instinct to cling to any good memory and pretend it outweighed the bad. But I couldn't pretend anymore. By 9, I was sitting in Margaret's office, the morning sun slanting across the polished oak desk. She flipped through the papers, adjusting her reading glasses. "You understand this may cause some conflict," she said finally, looking up. "If you put their names on the deed, they technically have ownership rights. But as long as you retained primary ownership and didn't create an irrevocable trust, you can amend it. It's your property." She said it plainly, but the relief that washed over me was dizzying. I hadn't ruined my chances to reclaim my life. "I want it done," I said quietly. She nodded. "Then let's start." Over the next hour, she walked me through every step, the filings, the affidavits, the notarizations. She explained how to draft a formal notice to each of them so they couldn't claim they were blindsided. "You don't owe them anything beyond what the law requires," she added, her voice gentler now. "You've been more than generous." I didn't trust myself to speak. I just pressed my palm over my heart, feeling the way it thundered, half fear, half something that felt like triumph. When all the paperwork was in a neat stack on Margaret's desk, she took off her glasses and studied me. "May I ask what finally changed your mind?" For a moment, I considered telling her about the whispers, about the small humiliations that had piled up over the years until they collapsed under their own weight. But instead, I said simply, "They mistook my kindness for weakness, and I'm tired of proving them right." Margaret's eyes softened, and she reached across the desk to squeeze my hand. "You're doing the right thing," she said. "You're taking back what's yours." I walked out of her office into the bright morning, clutching the documents like a lifeline. The sky seemed bluer than it had in years, the air fresher. As I stood on the sidewalk, I realized I hadn't felt this steady, this sure of myself since Harold had died. I wasn't a fragile old woman desperate for company. I was a woman who still owned something, and someone, to fight for. I got into my car, buckled my seatbelt with hands that no longer shook, and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. They thought I had no backbone. They were about to learn otherwise. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the nerves had started to creep back in. The papers on the passenger seat felt heavy as stone. But as I turned off the engine and looked up at the house, my house, I felt my resolve settle again. I carried the folder inside and laid it on the kitchen table. My hands were steadier now. Every so often I caught my reflection in the glass of the hutch, and I almost didn't recognize the woman staring back at me. She looked calm, almost fierce. Over the next 2 days, I drafted the notices. Margaret had offered to send them on my behalf, but some part of me wanted to do it myself, to look each of them in the eye and make it clear that this was not an impulsive decision. I waited until Saturday, when I knew they'd all be at David and Janet's house for their usual brunch. It felt fitting, in a way, that the same gathering where they'd planned my future without me would be the setting for this. The drive over felt longer than it ever had. The familiar roads, the oak trees lining the curbs, all of it looked different now, like I'd stepped out of the life they expected me to lead and into something I was choosing for myself. I parked at the curb and took a moment to breathe. My pulse skittered in my throat, but I refused to let it win. When I stepped up to the porch, I could hear their voices inside. David laughing, Janet's nasal chime, Todd's low mutter. I rang the bell. A hush fell on the other side of the door before footsteps approached. Janet opened it, her mouth already pursing with irritation. "Marjorie," she said, surprise flickering across her face. "We weren't expecting—" "I know," I said evenly. "May I come in?" She stepped aside, but not before giving me a look that tried and failed to make me feel small. Inside, everyone went silent when they saw me. David set down his coffee. Kelsey's eyes darted from my face to the envelope in my hand. I didn't bother with pleasantries. I walked to the dining table and set the stack of notices down. "These are for each of you," I said, my voice calm but carrying enough force that no one interrupted. "They're formal notices of removal from the deed on my house, effective immediately." For a beat, no one moved. Then David reached for one of the envelopes with a laugh that sounded too loud. "What is this, Marjorie?" he said. "Some kind of joke?" "It's not a joke," I said quietly. "You no longer have any claim to my property." Janet's face went red. "You can't just—" "I can," I cut in. My hands were steady. "And I have." The silence after that was the longest I'd ever endured with them. Kelsey looked stricken, her mouth opening and closing. Todd's jaw flexed as he avoided my gaze. Janet finally found her voice. "You're making a mistake. After everything we've done for you—" I felt something dark and bitter rise in me, but I kept my tone level. "Everything you've done for me? Or everything you thought you'd take from me?" She opened her mouth to argue, but I held up a hand. "I heard you, last week. I heard every word you said about me." David blanched. "Marjorie, we didn't mean—" "You did," I said. "And that's fine. You're entitled to your opinions, but you're not entitled to my home." For a moment, I thought Janet might scream. Instead, she took a breath and pasted on a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "If this is about money, we can talk about—" "This isn't about money," I said. "It's about respect." Kelsey finally spoke, her voice small. "Aunt Marjorie, please, we didn't mean to hurt you." I turned to her, feeling a flicker of old affection. But I'd learned the hard way that affection without respect is worth nothing. "I know you didn't mean for me to hear it," I said, "but you did mean it, and now I know where I stand." I straightened my shoulders. So this is where I draw the line. No one tried to stop me when I turned to leave. I felt their eyes on my back, but for once I didn't feel ashamed. I felt lighter, stronger. When I stepped outside into the bright morning, I took a breath so deep it almost hurt. It tasted like freedom. I drove home in a kind of stunned clarity, like the world had snapped into focus for the first time in years. My hands were steady on the wheel, my heart calm in my chest. It wasn't until I turned onto my street that the first pang of doubt tried to worm its way in. What if they never spoke to me again? What if I had finally, irreversibly burned every bridge left between us? But then I pulled into my driveway, the driveway Harold had poured by hand, and I looked up at the house, the familiar lines of the porch and the windows that had held so many memories, and I remembered exactly why I had done this. Because no one gets to diminish me in the place I love most. I was halfway up the front steps when my phone rang. The caller ID flashed David's name. I let it go to voicemail. Not 10 seconds later, it rang again. Janet this time, then Todd, then David again. I set the phone on the hall table and left it there, silenced, let them stew in their indignation. It wasn't long before the messages began pouring in. First, David's voice tight with forced calm. "Marjorie, you can't be serious. We need to talk about this before you do something you can't undo." Then Janet's brittle tone. "I don't know what you think you heard, but you're overreacting. You've always been too sensitive." That was the part that almost made me laugh. Too sensitive. The accusation of every bully who'd ever been caught. Another message chimed, Kelsey sounding shaken. "Aunt Marjorie, please call me." I didn't mean any of it. I was just repeating what Dad said. "I'm so sorry." For a moment, her words softened me, but I didn't call her back. I needed time to think, to breathe without their expectations pressing down on me. I spent the afternoon tending my garden, pulling weeds and pruning the roses Harold had planted along the fence. My knees complained, my back ached, but I felt more alive than I had in years. Each clip of the shears felt like shedding another layer of guilt I'd worn too long. By dusk, I came back inside to a phone full of missed calls and voicemails. I listened to them one by one, not to torture myself, but to be sure I wasn't imagining the ugliness. Janet's voice grew shriller with each message. "This is ridiculous. Do you have any idea how this looks? The family is going to think you've lost your mind." David's tone turned from patronizing to pleading. "You're overreacting, Marjorie. We can sort this out. We've always taken care of you, always taken care of me." I almost flung the phone across the room, but instead I turned it off and set it aside. They had never taken care of me. They had tolerated me so long as I was convenient, so long as my generosity filled their gaps. But the moment I stopped being useful, I became an inconvenience. I would no longer mistake proximity for love. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in years. I didn't wake to the usual chorus of worries, didn't relive Harold's funeral or the endless days afterward when I thought I'd never feel anything again. When the morning sun woke me, I felt a strange kind of peace. I got up, brewed my coffee, and sat at the kitchen table where so much had begun and so much had ended. It was time to stop waiting for their acceptance. Time to start living on my own terms. And if they couldn't understand that, well, that was no longer my burden to carry. The days that followed were a study in contrasts. In the mornings, I felt clear-headed, even light, as though I'd shrugged off a heavy coat I'd been wearing for decades. I went about my routines, watering the garden, reading the newspaper, making the meals I liked instead of the ones that would please guests. But each afternoon, the phone would start again. Calls, messages, sometimes polite, sometimes angry. David's voice swung between fatherly scolding and desperate pleading. Janet left voicemails so venomous I stopped listening halfway through. They tried everything: shame, guilt, nostalgia. Kelsey's messages were the hardest to hear. She was the only one who sounded genuinely remorseful. But even then, I couldn't ignore the fact that she'd been part of it too. That she'd sat there and let them dissect my worth like I was a burden to be managed. It wasn't until the fourth day that they finally showed up at my door. I was in the living room, folding laundry, when I saw David's car pull into the driveway. Janet climbed out after him, her mouth set in that hard line I'd come to recognize over the years, like she was bracing herself for battle. I could have ignored the bell, pretended I wasn't home, but I was tired of pretending, so I opened the door. David's face brightened in false relief. "Marjorie, thank God, we've been worried." I didn't step aside to let them in. I'm fine, I said evenly. Janet's eyes flicked past me into the hall, as if expecting to find proof I'd lost my mind. We need to discuss this face to face, she said. You can't just cut your family out. I folded my arms. I didn't cut you out of my life, just my deed. Her cheeks flushed pink. You're being spiteful. I took a slow breath, measuring my words. Number, I'm being clear. You thought you were entitled to my home because you assumed I wouldn't stand up for myself. You were wrong. David held up a placating hand. Can we please come in and talk? I didn't move. Say what you came to say. He sighed as though I were the unreasonable one. You've put us in a very difficult position, Marjorie. We've already discussed plans. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Plans? He shifted uncomfortably. We were thinking, when you were ready, it would make sense to sell the house and split the proceeds. It's too much for you to manage alone. Janet jumped in, her voice bright with false concern. It's for your own good. You can't keep up with all this. You're nearly 70. And there it was, the truth they'd never bothered to disguise. They hadn't been helping me. They'd been waiting me out. I felt my hands start to shake, but I steadied them on the doorframe. I appreciate your honesty, I said softly, but I'm not ready to leave my home, and I'm certainly not ready to sign it over to people who see me as an inconvenience. David rubbed a hand over his mouth. You're being emotional. Something in me snapped. For once, I said, my voice rising, I am, and it feels wonderful. I stepped back, my hand on the door. This conversation is over. Janet's eyes flashed. You'll regret this. I met her gaze without blinking. Number, I won't. And I closed the door in their faces. My heart was pounding so hard I had to lean against the wall to catch my breath. But as the car pulled away, taking their resentment with them, I felt something close to joy. This house wasn't just 4 walls and a roof. It was proof that I still had the power to choose who I shared my life with. And from now on, that list would be very, very short. After that day, the silence was almost shocking. The calls stopped. The messages dried up. For a few days, I kept expecting the next wave, some legal threat or a letter meant to scare me back into line. But it never came. Instead, the quiet settled over the house like a warm blanket. At first, it felt strange. The absence of their voices was an emptiness I didn't know what to do with. For so long, their opinions, however cruel, had filled up the space around me. But as the days passed, I started to notice how peaceful it felt to be alone without being lonely. I woke up early and walked the garden path Harold had laid down, the morning dew soaking the cuffs of my jeans. I sat on the porch in the afternoons with a book, listening to the wind in the trees without the constant undertone of judgment. For the first time in years, I found myself thinking about what I wanted instead of what they expected. I cleaned out the spare bedrooms, boxing up the relics of other people's lives, Kelsey's forgotten craft projects, Todd's old sports trophies, Janet's casseroles and condescension. Each time I sealed a box and carried it to the garage, I felt lighter. I made small changes around the house. New curtains in the kitchen, a fresh coat of paint on the porch railing. I planted daffodils in the garden beds along the fence. One afternoon while I was standing in the yard, dirt under my fingernails, a neighbor I hadn't spoken to in years paused on her walk. "Marjorie," she said with a smile, "your place looks wonderful." I looked up, surprised by the warmth in her voice. "Thank you." She hesitated, then asked gently, "Have you had company lately?" I almost told her no, that no one came by anymore, but instead I said, "Just me, and that's enough," because it was. For the first time since Harold died, I wasn't waiting for someone else to fill the quiet. I was learning to enjoy it. A few weeks later, a letter arrived. The envelope was thin and white, my name scrawled across the front in Kelsey's careful handwriting. I stood at the kitchen counter, holding it for a long moment before I finally opened it. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper. Aunt Marjorie, I don't expect you to forgive me. I know I hurt you. I know I sat there and let them talk about you like you weren't in the next room, and I'm ashamed of that. You were always kind to me. You were the only person who made me feel like I mattered when I was a child. I don't blame you for taking your name back. I'm sorry it took losing your trust to understand how much you gave us. I hope you're okay. I hope you know that at least one of us loves you for who you are, not what you can give. Kelsey. I read it twice. The first time, my throat tight with sorrow. The second time, with something closer to acceptance. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the roll-top desk. I didn't write her back, not yet, but I knew I would when I was ready, because some bridges don't have to stay burned forever. Some just need time. That evening, I made myself a cup of tea and sat on the porch as the sun set. The garden was in full bloom, the daffodils bright against the grass. As the sky darkened, I thought about everything I'd lost and everything I'd finally reclaimed. My name, my home, my dignity, and, perhaps most precious of all, my peace. I thought about the words they'd hurled behind my back. No backbone, no strength, no purpose, and felt a small, quiet triumph in my chest, because they were wrong. I had never been spineless. I had simply been too willing to bend for people who never deserved that grace. Never again. I closed my eyes, letting the breeze brush my face. From now on, this house would be a place where only love and respect were welcome. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt truly, unshakably free.